Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Sometimes the smallest sentence you say at the family table is not just a comeback. It is the moment when years of unpaid debts and silent sacrifices finally stop. That Sunday dinner was supposed to be routine. My mother had this habit of running a scoreboard in public, and everyone already knew the pattern. She would brag about my brother Ethan, list his newest purchases, and then turn the spotlight on me as if I were lagging behind. This time she said it louder than usual. Your brother just bought a second car. When will you catch up? The table laughed politely, and Ethan smirked in that way he always does when he knows Mom has given him the upper hand. I sat there, chewing slowly, feeling the familiar weight of years of swallowing these digs. And then I said it, clear enough that every fork stopped for a second. I already did. I just don't share my wins with doubters. My mother's glass nearly slipped, and I could see the color rise in her face. Ethan tried to chuckle it off, but the silence stretched long enough for everyone to feel the shift. For years, I had been the quiet one who showed up, paid the hidden bills, and fixed the disasters no one else wanted to acknowledge. When Dad forgot to send in the property tax, I was the one who wired the money at the last minute so their house did not end up on a delinquent list. When Ethan's first car deal fell apart because his credit was a joke, I got the midnight call begging for help, and I transferred the down payment while he promised he would pay me back. That was nearly a decade ago, and I still had the text on my phone. I never complained because part of me thought that was just what a daughter did, what a sister did, what the responsible one did. And yet every Sunday, I was treated like the underachiever who needed to catch up. That night, though, I was done with the game. I let them laugh, let Ethan make some crack about me secretly winning the lottery. Then I leaned back and told them I had already wired money for Mom's prescription this month, and it was the last time I would ever do it. I reminded them how many times I covered utilities when they were late, how many times I topped off Ethan's insurance just to stop his car from getting suspended, and how many quiet favors I had done without ever bringing them up at the table. Mom brushed it off with a wave of her hand, calling me dramatic, while Dad muttered that we could talk about it later. Ethan rolled his eyes and said I was just bitter that he knew how to enjoy life. But I had already made up my mind. Under the table, my phone buzzed with a reminder I had set weeks earlier: cancel auto pay. While they were still talking over each other, I tapped a few buttons and shut down every payment tied to my name. No more property tax top-offs, no more utilities, no more small gifts that were actually bills disguised as gratitude. A notification popped up almost immediately. Lean reminder. Auto renewal disabled. The timing was perfect. I smirked without meaning to, and Mom caught it. She asked sharply, "What did you just do?" I looked her straight in the eye and said, "I stopped paying your bills." The table went silent. Ethan scoffed that I was bluffing, but Dad looked worried because he knew exactly which bills I had been covering. Mom muttered something about family sticking together, but her voice cracked just slightly. I did not explain further. I just let it sit there, heavy and undeniable. For once, I was not the one scrambling to hold everything up behind the scenes. I was the one letting go of the rope. The rest of dinner was a blur of half-hearted conversation. Ethan tried to redirect the attention back to his car, talking about the leather seats and the new sound system, but the excitement had drained from the room. I could see Mom stealing glances at me, as if she was trying to figure out whether I was serious. She had no idea that I had been preparing for this moment for months, quietly shifting things into place so that the second I cut the cord, they would feel it. By the time dessert came out, Ethan was scrolling through his phone, ignoring everyone, while Dad poured himself another glass of wine and avoided eye contact. I sat there, calm, almost detached, watching the little cracks form in the script my family had been performing for years. It was the first time in my life that I felt the balance tilt. They had always assumed I would never dare to step out of line, never dare to force them to carry their own weight. They were wrong. When I drove home that night, my phone was buzzing nonstop. A group chat full of relatives was already lighting up with questions and accusations. Mom had wasted no time painting me as the ungrateful child who was abandoning her family. Ethan chimed in with jokes about me keeping secret millions. I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled up the folder I had built over the years, screenshots of every transfer, every receipt, every tax payment, every emergency loan. I knew exactly when to drop them. But not yet. Tonight, all I needed was for them to sit in the new reality. I was done paying. And as I turned into my driveway, I realized something I had never allowed myself to admit before. They needed me far more than I had ever needed them. And they were about to find out just how true that was. By the next morning, the group chat had become a stage where everyone who loved easy narratives showed up with popcorn and loud opinions, and while the pings stacked up with cousins asking if I had finally snapped, and an aunt offering prayer hands in spirit, even though she will tell anyone who listens that prayer requires action, not gossip, I brewed coffee, set the mug down, opened the folder I built across years that felt longer than they should have, and decided that if this conversation was going to happen, it would happen on ground I prepared, with words I could stand behind later, and with evidence that does not need me to explain or beg or rescue their memories from the fog that always seems to blow in whenever money is mentioned. I scrolled to the oldest property tax receipt with my name in the payer field and their address in the beneficiary field, and that little confirmation line that once gave me relief now felt like a weight I could release, then added the next year and the next because the pattern matters more than any single transfer, and when I attached the late-night text from Ethan that said he was stranded at the dealership, that he just needed a small down payment to get started, that commissions were about to explode and he would square it up in no time, I felt no shame and no pleasure, only the steady clarity that the truth is not cruel when it is calm and complete. I dropped the screenshots into the chat with exactly one sentence that carried no sarcasm and no venom, only the boundary I needed to hear in my own voice. Here is what I paid. Here is what was promised. Here is where it ends. Predictably, the room went hot, because people who have lived off the steam from other people's quiet labor do not go cold without noise. And my mother wrote a long paragraph about family and loyalty and sacrifices she claims to have made even though the numbers stubbornly insist otherwise, and my father, who hates conflict the way some people hate rain on a Saturday, texted me privately to ask if we could please not do this in front of everyone, because there are family reputations to protect. And neighbors who might hear, as if the neighbor's opinion can negotiate with a bank or pay a pharmacist when a card declines. Ethan, who has always used humor as a broom to sweep away accountability, posted a selfie with the second car parked at an angle that favored the rims more than the reality of his monthly note, and wrote that real winners do not keep receipts, they keep moving. I could almost hear the dealer's finance manager laughing from a distance. Instead of arguing, I sent a quiet email to Maya with the attachments and asked her to formalize what we had discussed months ago in case the day arrived when the difference between a favor and a loan needed to be notarized rather than remembered. She replied with a draft that used plain language I could read without a legal dictionary, a repayment schedule with no interest if Ethan began immediately, and a reminder that the old handwritten IOU he signed after a different holiday meltdown still carried a clause we had tucked in, because I have learned that generosity without structure becomes a story other people rewrite in their own handwriting. The clause tied repayment to the vehicle or any subsequent vehicle acquired while the debt remains outstanding, which sounded dramatic when we first wrote it, but in practice simply meant that if Ethan kept buying cars while pretending the original debt did not exist, the paper would not pretend with him. I sent Ethan the schedule first, because the kindest thing you can do for someone who refuses to look down is quietly point to the ground before they step into the hole, and I kept the tone simple, almost boring, because drama feeds denial while facts starve it. He replied with jokes, then with a block of insults that reeked of reheated pride, then with a promise that he would never sign anything I sent, then with silence that lasted exactly as long as it took me to forward the notarized IOU and the clause to the email address on file for the lender's compliance team, a step that felt less like a strike and more like setting a clock back to the correct time. The compliance contact wrote back within an hour to acknowledge receipt, to thank me for clarity, and to explain that they would review and note a potential subordinate interest should the borrower default, which is not a headline anyone wants on their personal finances, and not a thread either, just a light turned on in a room where Ethan preferred shadows. While that was happening, The wider family took sides the way people do when taking a side costs nothing but a comment, and although a few cousins sent private messages saying they always suspected I was the one who held the walls up while the rest of the house threw parties, most preferred the easier story where I am jealous and brittle and punishing everyone because I cannot stand to see Ethan happy. I did not defend myself because every defense becomes a new battleground, and I have no intention of living my life inside a courtroom run by people who never read the filings. I posted a final message to the chat that said I would not be discussing money there again and that any financial questions should be directed to me by email where I would answer with documents only, and then I muted the thread, poured more coffee, and waited for the first tremor. It arrived not through the family but through Tessa, who called from her office with the kind of voice I trust, because it has never once asked me to set myself on fire to keep someone else warm. She told me a vendor reliability audit had been scheduled for the following week, routine and predictable, and that if Ethan's finances showed instability tied to liens or flags, his vendor badge would pause pending review. Which sounded clinical until you translated it into rent and groceries and pride. I felt that old instinct to put a cushion under the fall, to slow the descent, to save the day in a way that costs me another year, and then I remembered the dinner table, the laughter, and the question that turned my life into a scorecard. I told Tessa to follow policy, to treat him like any other rep, and to let the process do what it always does when paper meets air. Late that evening, after a day of cold shoulders and hot takes, Ethan posted a new photo with the second car shining under dealership lights, with a caption about paying in full, with a careless tag that linked to the lender's page where the plan type was visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at, and I felt the click of a puzzle piece sliding into place, not because I wanted to win a petty round, but because the truth prefers daylight. I texted Maya the screenshot and wrote only 2 words that said everything that needed saying without gloating or explanation. I wrote, "It qualifies." When Maya placed the call to the lender's compliance desk, her tone was not sharp or threatening but professional and precise, the sort of voice that lets the person on the other end know that this is not about emotions or grudges, but about documents, signatures, and obligations that cannot be erased by laughter at a dinner table. She explained that there was a notarized IOU, that the language included the vehicle clause, and that she was forwarding both the signed copy and the repayment schedule already offered in good faith. The man at the compliance office did not sound surprised, and he certainly did not sound amused, because in his world collateral is not about family squabbles, but about enforceable interests, and his only responsibility was to note the claim and attach it to the borrower's record. By the end of that afternoon, the system reflected that should Ethan default, there would be a subordinate lien tied to the car he had been bragging about less than 48 hours earlier, and the smug certainty he had paraded online now had a shadow running alongside it, one that would not be ignored when payments slipped or contracts renewed. The discovery did not arrive gently for him. The dealership called to clarify a small flag on his account, and although they did not say much more than that, the message was clear enough that even he could not laugh it away. He stormed into the group chat again, this time not with jokes or photos, but with accusations written in capital letters, calling me a traitor who had poisoned his success because I could not stand to see him win, and my mother echoed him immediately, asking how I could go so far as to involve strangers in what should be a family matter. I read every word and felt none of the guilt they were trying to assign to me, because what they called betrayal was nothing more than the overdue arrival of accountability, and what they wanted to preserve as family business was a cycle of me paying silently while they pretended debts never existed. I did not respond to the insults, but I did respond to the substance. I reminded Ethan that the schedule remained open, that no interest was added, that he had every chance to resolve this without consequence if he simply acknowledged what he owed and began paying it down. He ignored the calmness and attacked my motives, insisting that I was jealous, bitter, and cruel. When I finally wrote back, I said only that paper is patient, paper does not forget, and the only thing standing between him and peace was his signature on an agreement he already knew was fair. It was not a dramatic speech, and it was not a plea. It was simply the truth. That same day, I forwarded the situation to Tessa, Not because I wanted to punish Ethan further, but because transparency matters when people's money is involved, and his sales contract with her company explicitly included a financial reliability clause. She listened quietly, sighed, and admitted that she had suspected trouble for a while, but had never wanted to embarrass him by asking. Now she could not ignore it. As long as the lien notice sat on his record, she was required to pause his vendor status pending review, because the risk of letting him handle client deposits while his own finances unraveled was simply too high. I told her I understood, and though she offered sympathy, there was no hesitation in her decision. When Ethan received the suspension notice later that evening, his anger reached a level I had never seen before. He left a long voicemail on my phone, nearly incoherent with rage, saying that I had cost him his livelihood, that I had humiliated him in front of his colleagues, that I had crossed a line that no sibling should ever cross. I listened twice, and the second time I paid attention not to the words, but to the cracks in his voice, the places where anger was just a mask for panic, and instead of calling him back or rushing to smooth it over as I had done my entire life, I deleted the message and placed the phone face down on the table. For once I chose silence over rescue, and in that silence I felt stronger than I had in years. The fallout rippled quickly through the rest of the family. My mother called to tell me that I had destroyed Ethan's career, ignoring the fact that what actually destroyed it was his refusal to pay what he owed, and my father muttered that I had taken things too far, though he had no concrete suggestion for what far enough would have looked like. Relatives messaged me privately, some offering support and others warning me that I would regret burning bridges, but what none of them seemed able to grasp was that these bridges were not made of wood or stone but of my time, my labor, my bank account, and my patience, and they had been collapsing under me long before I ever struck a match. That night, as I sat alone with the quiet ringing in my ears after so much noise, I realized that every step I had taken had been careful, deliberate, and grounded in proof. There were no lies, no tricks, no exaggerations, only the documents Ethan signed, the payments I made, and the choices he refused to face. For years I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was worth the cost, but now, as his laughter turned to rage and his bragging turned to panic, I saw clearly that peace built on one person's silence is not peace at all. And while the group chat continued to erupt with theories and accusations, I simply closed it, set my phone aside, and allowed the weight of years of unpaid debts to shift from my shoulders onto the shoulders of the one who created them. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel like the quiet, responsible sister cleaning up behind the scenes. I felt like someone who had finally stepped into the light with every receipt in hand, daring them to deny the truth written in their own signatures. And as the night grew longer, I knew this was not the end of the conflict, but only the middle of a process that would rewrite the balance of power in our family forever. When my mother realized that shouting in the family chat was not bringing me back into line, and that Ethan's anger was not enough to scare me into reversing what had already been set in motion, she decided to escalate in the only way she knew how. By turning the extended family into a jury, spreading her version of events in phone calls and messages filled with half-truths, omissions, and carefully chosen phrases meant to paint me as the cold, calculating daughter who had decided to sabotage her brother's life out of jealousy. I began to hear from cousins who suddenly remembered me at every holiday table as distant, and from an uncle who asked whether I had really involved lawyers over something so small as if years of property tax bills, utility payments, and thousands of dollars in emergency transfers could be reduced to pocket change simply because my family had grown comfortable treating my contributions as invisible. The irony was sharp, but I chose not to answer with long defenses, because I had learned that every explanation only gave them another angle to twist. Instead, I decided that if the story was going to be told, it would be told in a room where facts had weight and where no one could talk over me with nostalgia and selective memory. I invited my parents to meet me for coffee, telling them that I wanted them to hear everything directly from me without the distortion of group messages or emotional late-night calls. They arrived together, my mother walking in with her chin raised as if she were preparing for battle, and my father trailing slightly behind, already looking as though he wanted to escape the conversation before it even began. I did not come alone. I brought Maya, who had been my steady anchor through all of this, and Tessa, who agreed to join because the time had come for my parents to understand that my involvement in their lives extended far beyond a few wire transfers or casual loans to Ethan. The meeting began with predictable hostility. My mother wasted no time accusing me of humiliating Ethan, of dragging private family matters into public spaces, of tarnishing the Hayes name with legal threats that outsiders could now see. I let her talk, because every word she spoke built the stage for the reveal I had planned. When she finally paused, expecting me to defend myself, I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of every tax receipt I had paid on their behalf, every confirmation of pharmacy bills settled by my account, every note of utilities cleared at the last minute to avoid disconnection. My mother flipped through them quickly at first, then more slowly when the pile refused to shrink, and I could see her grip tighten on the papers as if she were holding evidence of something she desperately wanted to deny. My father said little, but his silence was louder than her outrage, because deep down he knew exactly what those pages represented. Then I let Tessa speak. She explained, in her calm and matter-of-fact way, that 2 years earlier her company had been on the brink of collapse, that contractors had been ready to walk, and that it was only because I stepped in as a silent investor that they managed to stay afloat. Ethan's job, his commissions, and his chance to play the successful salesman had all depended on that deal, though he had never once mentioned it to the family because he either did not understand the mechanics or preferred to believe that his charm alone had saved him. The truth landed hard. My mother opened her mouth to protest, but Tessa cut her off gently, reminding her that without that intervention Ethan would not have had the income to buy his first car, let alone parade a second one across social media. For the first time in years, my mother did not have a quick retort. I told them plainly that I was proud of what I had built, that I had no reason to apologize for keeping records, and that I would never again allow my contributions to be erased so someone else could play the hero. I reminded them that loyalty is not measured by silence or by how much humiliation a person is willing to endure at the dinner table, but by the willingness to stand up when the bills come due. I also revealed that the so-called family generosity they had been boasting about was often funded by grants and programs I had quietly secured in their names, including a community hardship credit that had reduced their costs last year. I had already transferred the renewal responsibility to my father, along with clear instructions, so they could continue it on their own without me as the middleman. The final move of that meeting was deliberate. I pulled out one last envelope and placed it on the table, sliding it toward my father. Inside was a termination of guarantor form prepared by Maya, a document that would allow him to step away from Ethan's car note if Ethan agreed to the repayment plan already sitting in his inbox. My father looked down at it for a long time, clearly torn between the instinct to keep the peace and the dawning realization that he had been dragged into financial quicksand by a son who never considered the consequences. My mother's eyes darted between him and me, her lips pressed tight, her control of the narrative slipping with each passing second. I leaned forward and told them that this was not revenge for the cruel words at Sunday dinner, though those words had sparked the timing. It was a boundary, a line drawn after years of silence, a decision to refuse the role of invisible provider who never demanded recognition or repayment. I told them I wanted peace too, but peace could not exist when one child was paraded as the star while the other carried the costs in secret. If they wanted real peace, they needed to acknowledge what had been hidden and stop pretending that loyalty meant enabling irresponsibility. The conversation ended with no hugs and no promises, only the sound of my father folding the papers back into the envelope and my mother refusing to look me in the eye. Yet even in that silence, I felt the balance shift. For the first time, I had forced the truth into the open where it could not be swept aside, and whether they signed or stalled, whether they admitted it today or a year from now, they would never again be able to claim ignorance. As we walked out of that coffee shop, Maya at my side and Tessa nodding once in quiet solidarity, I knew that the story my family had been telling for years had cracked beyond repair. My mother could spin it however she liked to cousins and neighbors, but the documents existed, the witnesses existed, and the next move belonged to my father, who now held in his hands a chance to free himself from Ethan's recklessness. And though no signatures had yet been made, the silence at that table told me more than any words could. The legend of Ethan as the family savior was over, and they all knew it. When Ethan refused to sign the repayment plan after the meeting, I felt no surprise, because pride had always been his most reliable currency, more valuable to him than money, reputation, or even relationships. And though he had the chance to take the clean exit I had laid in front of him, he clung instead to the idea that admitting anything would mean conceding defeat to me. I knew that the next step would be unpleasant for him, but I also knew that avoiding it would only prolong the inevitable, so I worked with Maya to file a simple procedural notice, a UCC claim marking my subordinate interest in his vehicle, not as a punishment, but as an acknowledgement of what was already written into his own IOU. Within days, the dealership tightened his loan terms, added scrutiny, and adjusted his payment schedule, and although no one spoke it aloud, it was clear that the shine of his second car had already dulled under the weight of flagged paperwork and cautious lenders who suddenly saw him not as a carefree customer but as a potential liability. The reaction came swiftly. Ethan exploded again in private messages, sending me paragraphs filled with outrage about how I had destroyed his freedom and made him a laughingstock in front of people at work, but behind the bravado I could sense the cracks widening. The vendor suspension at Tess's company had already hit him where it hurt most, because it threatened the income he used to parade as proof of his success, and when combined with the dealership's sudden reluctance to treat him as a trustworthy client, he was cornered in a way he had never been before. My mother tried once more to rally her version of events, calling me with a shaky voice and insisting that I was punishing Ethan too harshly, that family disputes should never have reached this level of exposure, that I had gone beyond boundaries into cruelty. I listened patiently and then told her that boundaries are only visible when they are enforced, and that if she had not spent years dismissing every quiet contribution I made as just helping out, none of this would have been necessary. She went silent, and though I could feel her anger radiating through the phone, she could no longer deny the truth of what I said. In the meantime, I prepared the final step of my plan, the one that would close the loop completely so that, even if the noise continued, the practical reality would stand firm. I transferred ownership of my parents' property tax escrow account to my father, leaving behind a small buffer I personally funded one last time, clearly labeled as a closing gift, so that they would have time to adjust without being thrown into immediate chaos. Then I removed every trace of my financial information from their accounts, their portals, and their automatic payment systems, ensuring that no future bill could quietly reroute itself to me under the assumption that I would always cover it. For the first time in nearly a decade, I was free from the invisible chains of their dependence, and while I expected pushback, the act itself filled me with a sense of peace that no argument could touch. I announced the change with a single text to the family chat, stripped of drama and free from lengthy explanation. From today, I wrote, "Everyone carries their own weight. I wish you well." The silence that followed was louder than any insult they could have hurled, because the weight of finality hung in every word. My mother eventually responded with a short, clipped message telling me that I had abandoned them, and Ethan fired back with threats of never speaking to me again, but none of it mattered, because the systems were already in place and the shift could not be undone. It was not about their approval anymore. It was about mine. Days later, Ethan called again, but this time his tone was different. There was no laughter, no insults, no capital letters, or performative outrage. His voice was low, tired, and edged with something I had rarely heard from him before: defeat. He asked whether there was a way to make the payments in smaller amounts, something he could realistically keep up with without risking default, and though part of me wanted to let him flail until he learned the lesson fully, I also knew that a plan already existed that would serve both of us. I told him I would accept the same zero-interest schedule, but this time it would be automated, drafted directly from his account, and accompanied by a signed acknowledgement that the original debt had always been mine to collect, not a family gift that disappeared into the fog of selective memory. He hesitated but eventually agreed, and when the acknowledgement came back signed, scanned, and returned to my inbox, I felt the final piece of the puzzle lock into place. The most satisfying part was not the money, because I had long ago stopped expecting those transfers to balance the scales of what I had poured into that family. The real satisfaction came when I forwarded the signed acknowledgement to my mother with one simple sentence: "Please stop telling people you financed Ethan's start." "You did not." "I did. He is paying it back." There was no rebuttal she could craft that would stand against Ethan's own handwriting, no story she could spin that would erase the quiet, undeniable truth. For once, she had to sit with the reality that the narrative she built around her golden son and her unremarkable daughter had cracked wide open, and no amount of gossip could repair it. My father, to his credit, finally stepped forward. He signed the guarantor release that freed him from Ethan's reckless car loan, a signature that carried more weight than any apology he might have tried to offer, because it was an action, not just a word. He did not thank me in grand speeches or public gestures, but when he called afterward, his voice was soft and real, telling me he wished he had noticed sooner how much I carried, and though the words came too late to undo the years behind us, I accepted them because at least they were honest. When the first automatic deduction cleared from Ethan's account and the notification pinged on my phone with the message, "Payment received," I sat back, exhaled, and smiled, not out of triumph but out of relief. The cycle was over. The myths were dismantled. The endless loop of rescuing, enabling, and erasing myself had finally been broken. For the first time in years, I was not waiting for the next crisis call, the next midnight text, or the next guilt-ridden reminder of what I supposedly owed my family. I was free, and they were finally responsible for themselves. Later that week, my mother sent one last message asking if I would come to Sunday dinner, as if everything could simply reset with another plate on the table. I stared at the words for a long time before replying. "Maybe," I wrote, "if it is dinner, not court." And with that, I set the phone down, knowing that no matter what came next, the balance had shifted forever, and the woman who once paid quietly in the background had finally written her own ending.